I'd like to ask if you're amenable to agreeing the minutes from our last meeting in January.
Agreed.
And can you also, with item 4, our summary list of actions on pages 61 to 70, note the list of outstanding and completed actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. So that brings us on to the main item this morning, which is about water issues, and we have a number of guests with us here today who are very welcome. We're actually going to have 3 slightly different sets of guests, although I think Richard Aylard from Thames Water and Karen Gibbs from Thames Water are going to be, the Consumer Council for Water are going to be staying with us throughout the entire meeting, for which thank you very much. But I'll just introduce all of our guests, if I may. We have Natalie Fee, who's the Director of City to Sea. You're very welcome to be with us. We have Edward Palin, who's the Managing Director at Wattro Group and Chair of the GCA. We have Karen Gibbs, who I just mentioned, who's the Senior Policy Manager at the Consumer Council for Water. We have Richard Aylard, who's been with us once or twice previously, who is the Director of External Affairs and Sustainability at Thames Water. We have Tracy Stewart, who is from the, and I'm looking forward to having some discussion with you about some of the products, but she's the Director General of the Absorbent and Hygienic Product Managers Association, Manufacturers Association. And finally, last but not least on this panel, we have Seán Kerrigan, who is from EDANA. You're all very welcome to be with us today, and we're going to start with some questions, first of all, from me. And I'd like to start by talking about sewer blockages. And I'm going to address that to Richard to start with, and then see if anyone else would like to come in on that. What are the main causes of blockages and the effects of them?
Main causes are wet wipes and fats, oils and greases. And it's the combination of the two that causes the biggest problem. If you've got even a single strand of a root going through a sewer, wet wipe gets caught on it, some fat builds around that, another wet wipe arrives, and very quickly you've got a blockage. So if I could just talk about the problem of wet wipes, and I'm going to do a little demonstration in a minute, which you've asked me to do, but if a wet wipe is flushed, and hundreds of millions of them are every day, 3 things can happen. The first thing is it can make its way all the way through the sewers, uninterrupted, to our sewage works, where it ends up on a screen and has to be scraped off. We get, at the works that you visited the other day, Beckton Sewage Works, we get 30 tonnes of this material every day. That's only about a quarter of the total waste that we treat. So there's well over 100 tonnes of what we call rag going to landfill, because that's the only place you can take it, every single day, 100 tonnes a day. Wet wipes are quite a large part of that.
Sorry, can I just pick you up on that? And you just said that it all has to go to landfill because it's obviously a combination not just of the wet wipe material, the rag, and the fat, but obviously it's been in the sewer.
Yeah, it's mixed materials. It
Right.
can't be recycled, and you wouldn't want to incinerate it. So at the moment it goes to landfill. It's over 100 tonnes a day. But in addition, we call this rag. It's what we get off the screens. Quite a lot of it is wet wipes, but it's also everything from curtains to condoms. It's everything that everybody flushes that they shouldn't flush ends up on the screens. But in some ways, that's the best of the 3 outcomes that you can get with a wet wipe, because the second potential outcome is that it ends up caught up in one of these fatbergs which generate in our very big sewers. These are sewers that are big enough to get people in, and we've all seen the photographs. People have to go in there with pickaxes and high-pressure hoses to get this congealed mass out of the sewers. And the fatberg stories have done us very well in raising awareness, and there's now a fatberg exhibition at the Museum of London, which is doing very well for them. So we're using that as a story to get across the problem. But it's the third outcome that is actually the worst. The third outcome is that these wet wipes and fat cause a blockage in the small sewers, this sort of size, outside people's houses. We clear 85,000 blockages every year from those smaller sewers. And if we can't clear them before they cause a problem, in an average year, there's 2,000 homes in London get flooded either externally or internally with sewage as a result of those blockages. And the same blockages also cause an average of 80 pollution incidents every year, where it spews out of a manhole into a brook or a stream and into a river. So some of those cause a lot of environmental damage, some are cleaned up pretty quickly. So those are the three things that can happen when you flush a wet wipe, and they're all bad.
So you mentioned that the large fatbergs, which has become sort of quite prominent now, I think globally, and it's probably the new word has gone into the Oxford English Dictionary or wherever they add new words to, has raised the profile. Has there been any diminution in the amount of rag, of wet wipe and so on, the material that's going down the sewer over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, or is 30 tonnes the average per day at Beckton, 100 tonnes across your area? Has that stayed static?
It's more, it goes up and down a bit, but there's no discernible trend in what arrives at the sewage works. But what we've done is we've used the fatberg as a way of getting the message across to Londoners that there is a problem. So what we do is we then build on that. We have blockage hotspots. We know where these blockages, the smaller blockages, happen most, and we target local campaigns with door-to-door leafleting, advertising on bus shelters and things, and that has actually produced about a 20% reduction in blockages in those areas that we've targeted. So it's one of these things, it's a bit like water efficiency. You have to just keep on getting the message out over and over again. And you have got in your packs a map of the blockage hotspots across London.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the sort of non-flushable wipes and then also the fats, because obviously it's the combination of these two things in the sewers. The one thing that you haven't mentioned, I mean, you've talked about removing the rag on the screens, you talked about actually having to chip the fatbergs out of the sewers, but you haven't talked about the cost of all of this. Now, there presumably must be a cost in staff time, diverting staff to doing this who could be doing other things, but also just actual money spent on this.
The direct cost is about £12 million a year, but then there's also all the indirect costs, plus, as you say, the other things we could be doing with those people's time and effort. So it's an entirely unnecessary way to spend money if we could get the behaviour change that we need.
So £12 million a year that Thames Water could be spending on other things. Ways, yeah. I'm going to move seamlessly on to Caroline, who's going to start asking some questions then about the flushable stroke non-flushable material.
Indeed, although I just want to pick up on what you were just saying, Richard. I mean, do you think that there is, and I'm sorry, I'm talking completely off the cuff here, but if people are producing products that are causing these massive, massive public costs, should there not be a surcharge on wet wipes to actually directly for Thames Water to actually deal with the problem of people, what happens when they create fatbergs? So like a wet wipe tax or something, but...
It would be one way of dealing with it, but I think we'd much rather not do that. We'd much rather have, first of all, products which are genuinely flushable, which can be flushed, and there's a flushability standard being developed. We don't think there are any products on the market yet that are going to meet that standard, but at least having the standard will give manufacturers and their innovation team something to aim for. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is the existing products, we want much better, clearer labelling. So there is some labelling on some of the products. We'd like it in big letters on the front of the packaging, not the back of the packaging.
Right,
Do not flush.
Yes, okay, well, labelling is absolutely where these questions are heading. So my first question, which is to everyone on the panel, and particularly to Tracy and also to Natalie, is how can non-flushable items be prevented from clogging London's sewers? Tracy, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Key to preventing blockages by non-flushable items is education and labelling, as has just been described here. That's absolutely paramount. You've described very well how you used, for example, the fatberg story to great effect. Yeah. I was actually at a conference in Europe, I think maybe you were too, the week after that happened, and it was one of the first things that everybody said to me when they approached me. The message got across far and wide. How relevant it was to people in their home, I'm not sure what they were seeing something about a London sewer, but we're absolutely in agreement with everybody here that messaging, consumer education and better labelling is key to the solution. And we have a good story to tell in terms of our newly updated code of practice for product labelling, which requires an identified symbol to be used on the top of packaging and also on the side of packaging where packets are stacked that way up in supermarket shelves, so that at the point of purchase, consumers see that label, or the symbol rather, and also every time they use it, they see the symbol as well. And this is something that we're really embedding and working hard to ensure that all manufacturers take up.
Are manufacturers actually, I mean, it seems quite extraordinary that products can be sold in our supermarkets that can cause this kind of trouble if they're used incorrectly. It just seems quite extraordinary. If you're wiping your baby's bottom, you can use cotton wool and water. You don't need to use a wet wipe. And so the fact that they are causing these massive problems and huge amounts of public expenditure to sort them out, why aren't they actually, are they trying to make them so that they, make a different product so that it doesn't cause these problems?
Do you want to go for this?
Sure. So there are two types of wipe. There are ones that are classed as flushable and ones that are classed as non-flushable. And firstly, I'd just like to echo what was said before. I think the focus here is on the solution, and that comes about through changing consumer behaviour and not putting down the toilet what doesn't belong in the toilet. We're quite clear there's only three things that should really go down your toilet. Those are the three P's: pee, paper and poo. To go back to your question, there are a class of wipes that are labelled flushable. We don't think it would correctly affect consumer behaviour to make all items flushable, because there's a whole range of items of wipes, kitchen wipes, hygiene wipes, panty liners, for example, that also shouldn't go down the toilet. And we think if we were to launch a whole range of products classed as flushable, it would actually muddy the waters for the consumer. There's also the fact that in terms of functionality, making a wipe flushable makes it unfit for purpose. You wouldn't be happy wiping your baby's bottom with a flushable wipe. You wouldn't be happy using a kitchen towel that was designed to be flushed. It breaks down in water, it would break down in your kitchen.
So we've got the business of the education, that we need to make sure that it becomes socially unacceptable to put anything down
other than
a toilet.
paper and human waste.
I mean, as a ward councillor in Islington, I actually have a current piece of casework, which is a basement flooded with sewage because the manhole, there was a wet wipe blockage inside. They had their own little fatberg under the housing association home. So when Richard explained it was happening, it absolutely is happening, and it is, the impact of that on people's lives is absolutely miserable. The neighbouring homes have got this sewagey water coming through into their cellars. It's, these are really serious impacts and serious hygiene impacts and health impacts for
100%.
For
There's
residents.
no escaping the fact that it's nearing. It's a massive problem. There's no escaping that fact, and we're focusing on addressing it. And we believe the best route to that is, as I think Richard said as well, it's consumer education and labelling. And we'd like to do that in conjunction with the other stakeholders, with the water bodies again, with the retailers again. We think retail labelling, retail positioning, as Tracy mentioned, is quite critical. The distinction in the mind of the consumer needs to be very clear and loud.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back to the idea of alternatives, and maybe Natalie, you might want to come in here. Certainly in terms of period products, there are things like moon cups. You don't have to use disposable items when you're on your period. You don't have to use disposable items when you're cleaning up your baby. Do you have anything to say about alternatives to actually selling people products that would cause trouble in the sewer?
Absolutely, yeah. So a few points to pick up on there. But in terms of education around reusables, we've been trialling a menstruation education programme across schools in the Anglian Water region. So we're currently trialling a non-biased education around 17 schools for years sort of 7 right up to years sort of 15. So what that's doing is it's actually giving students the opportunity to learn about reusables at a very young age, as well as disposable menstrual products. And this is for all students to learn that there are the ways, and the environmental impacts of flushing and of our periods. So that also can include facial wipes and wipes as well. So that's an area that we're really interested in, because, you know, normalising reusable menstrual products is key. You know, we want to see them placed higher up in shelves in supermarkets, looking at reusable pads, reusable cups, and reusable period panties as well. So there's lots of options there that can actually stop this problem at source. So that's very much a key area for, especially seeing as I think it's next year in PSHE is going to become mandatory, and so menstruation education will become mandatory across schools. So it's a really, really good opportunity to actually embed the do not flush message, the 3 Ps message early on. In terms of just picking up on a couple of points.
Can I just ask you, what percentage of the current sanitary protection market, either internal or external, SAMPRO, is currently reusables as opposed to other?
I don't know, actually. It's a really good question. I don't know what percentage it is at the moment, but it would be a good one to watch, because it's going through a massive surge at the moment in terms of popularity, so it would be really good to see. And we have been looking with Anglian Water at actually doing a very kind of closed pilot area to see whether that does actually reduce the amount of menstrual items that are being flushed. So yeah, but I can certainly look into that figure. In terms of like the labelling on wipes, I think there's a lot more to be done there, because even on flushable wipes, for some, a lot of those still contain plastic. And on the back it says, well, they're flushable if you only flush one wipe at a time, you know, in quite small letters. So generally people aren't going to, it's a terrible waste of water. They're not going to wipe once, flush, wipe again, flush. You know, so I think that's a really, you know, a grey area that we need to be really aware of when it comes to saying that wipes are flushable. Obviously there's some great sort of action being taken around labelling on the front of pack. But I think, you know, removing plastic from the weaves is key, because as well as causing blockages, we know that they're changing the shape of the River Thames by the amount of them that are flowing out onto the river. They're actually changing the shape of the riverbank, these piling up, the wet wipes that are piling up there. So I think, you know, we need to make sure that there isn't any plastic in those weaves. And then when we're talking about behaviour change, if we're asking people not to flush, then, you know, generally you've got these dirty things in your hand. Well, what are you going to do with them? You know, it's around making sure then that there's education around bins, and, you know, that possibly having 2 bins in people's bathrooms. So there's a lot of areas to look at there.
So that's a massive behaviour change
It is.
thing. People are going to start having different bins in their bathrooms if they want to use those kind of products. Thank you. In just a bit more on the labelling, because it does seem that the labelling is, you know, bag it and bin it, don't flush it, is pretty clear. But are you, I mean, you know, what's the evidence that people are actually listening to these messages? Is there any research?
Plenty of interest. When the chair came to Beckton last week, we did a little demonstration for ITV, and we put a wet wipe in one pot, and we put some toilet paper in the other, and we had a very strong...
Blue Peter.
Richard on Blue Peter.
Show and tell.
And this was...
You're going to shake them.
We flushed these for a bit, and very quickly... it was obvious that one was disintegrating, the other one wasn't. That video has been watched 300,000 times on the ITV website, so there's plenty of interest in the topic.
Okay, we better send the chair
Well,
to
I think the chair should
Beckton
come
more
more
frequently with the TV crew.
In preparation for today's meeting, I'd actually visited the Beddington Sewage Treatment Works, the Beckton Sewage Treatment Works, where this demonstration was done, and I also went down the sewers, and I know a couple of other members, Assembly Member Bailey has also been down a sewer as well. And of course, as soon as you've been into the sewers and seen the actual fatbergs, however small they are, forming, obviously wearing quite a lot of protective clothing, for anyone who's watching this who thinks that we went down wearing our normal clothing. But of course, the fatbergs and the amount of rag at Beckton, and then the demonstration of how the wet wipe just does not disintegrate. And of course, that explains why you see so many of them arriving completely intact. They've made a very long journey through the sewers before they actually get to the sewage treatment works. Can I just ask you, Richard, is the wet wipe that you've just put in that jar a flushable one, in inverted commas, or a non-flushable one?
It's a non-flushable one, but we tried to find out what was in wet wipes a couple of years ago, and we couldn't get any very clear information. So we sent a number of samples off to Brunel University, and they put them under a scanning electron microscope, and you've actually got pictures in your pack that came from that. And what makes the wet wipe so pleasant to use? And this one I've got here is a Makeup Begone Pampering Wipe. Removes even waterproof mascara. I'll take their word for that. But it makes it nice and slippery and smooth, but those are microplastic fibres. So, when they do eventually break down, don't actually do much good for the environment either. So I take the point about, it's got to feel right for people to use, but I just think there must be scope for more innovation to get something that will do this when it's flushed and not that, but still be pleasant to use.
But what about the signage? I mean, I think that's
signage is important. I mean, there is on this one very, very small on the back. You can scarcely see it. A little picture of somebody dropping something in the toilet, and there's an X across it. But to be honest, you're just not going to see that on the supermarket shelf. Even if you were looking for it, it's quite hard to find. That
was my concern when we were at Beckton. Was I looked at the signage and I could hardly find it without a microscope.
I think it's also, there is just a culture that these are, it's a bit like plastic coffee cups and, and disposable plastic straws and other items. These are items that have been manufactured that people have just got used to as something that can be flushed. And actually, there needs to be a massive, massive wake up for people to understand, what the alternatives are, and actually pressure on the manufacturers to come up with alternatives that aren't as damaging. Do you think, Tracy and Seán, do you think that the manufacturers are aware that wet wipes are on a bit of a dodgy place at the moment?
They're acutely aware of the issues. I would say that this is a prime example of why a non-flushable wipe should not be flushed. This is a non-flushable wipe. And the problem is, or what we want to see as a solution, is helping consumers to identify between the two types. Flushable wipes are moist toilet tissue and wipes that come into contact with bodily fluids, such as a wipe that you would use to clean a toilet before you use it when you're out in public, or an intimate wipe. They form less than 10% of all wipes on the market. So it's about telling people which type of wipe is which. There's a very good story for non-flushable wipes. Don't forget, they're not just used for our faces and our bodies. They're used throughout hospitals. They've made massive differences to infection control. They are invaluable in terms of primary care and secondary care.
They're probably going to be disposed of properly in a hospital.
Absolutely. But wipes are here to stay. So what we must do is make sure that we work together with all the other stakeholders to ensure that we improve that labelling, we bring it to the top of the pack, we make it easily identifiable, absolutely recognisable across all languages as well, so that consumers know what they're buying and they know what to do with it.
Do you think that there could be more to be done around labelling and getting the producers to really take a bit more responsibility for the costs that they're causing to society by selling products that people are using inappropriately?
There's definitely is more to be done, and there's definitely more to be done in conjunction with the other stakeholders. This has been ongoing. Labelling efforts started in 2004, and it clearly wasn't enough. And they revised guidelines again every so often to make it more prominent. And as Tracy detailed, there'll be front of package, side of packaging labelling. But changing consumer awareness comes down to more than product labelling. Prominent labelling might be seen, but will it change the behaviour? I think a wider campaign is needed across all stakeholders, the water bodies, the retailers, the government bodies, the consumer bodies, and starting with the producers.
And would that kind of campaign, should that, in your opinion, also include promotion of alternatives to using these products? Because, I mean, obviously, the products are causing the problem, and there are alternatives, which we heard about earlier, menstrual products that don't require flushing, things that can be reused, washed and reused. We're seeing reusable nappies. People are prepared to change the type of products that they use to deal with these ordinary, everyday things that need mopping up or cleaning up or absorbing.
I think anything that alleviates the problem that the use of single-use plastic is causing is to be welcomed. Yeah. And that's across the board.
Which I think brings us neatly on, and perhaps we could ask Richard to give his 2 bottles the occasional shake so that by the end of the meeting we can see the difference between the wipe with the plastic fibres and the wipe with just the cellulose. But that's going to bring me on to Assembly Member Seán Bailey now, who's going to ask some questions about the plastic content of wipes and so on.
I share many of my fellow Assembly members' views on these products, and I'm going to take a slightly harsher line because I wonder if the manufacturers would want to remove plastic from this, because we use these things because they're convenient and they're comfortable. If you were to remove some of the plastic, would those 2 elements go away?
In fact, yes. And none of our members' products that are marketed as flushable contain plastic. Non-flushable do, because if they didn't, they would fall apart. They're designed to stay together, and I think we'll shake that throughout the meeting, and unless they produce something wrong, it won't break up.
My point is, let me ask you a question. What's the percentage in the market? How many of these things that are bought are flushable and are not flushable?
Currently in the UK, it's about 10%.
Are flushable. So you can see how, if you're from the public side of this conversation, we are concerned that these things that you know are unflushable are entering our system in huge numbers, but yet you do very little to remove the plastic, which is the only answer to making these things flushable.
Making everything flushable is not the answer. That is the point. And the products that are not flushable and shouldn't be flushed, and we need to help to ensure that they're not flushed, need to be of the composition that they are in order that they do the job that they're designed to do. A flushable wipe is entirely different. It doesn't have plastic in it, and it can be flushed.
My point is, what does a non-flushable wipe do that a flushable wipe can't do?
It contains its shape. It can clean your kitchen counter. It can clean a medical counter in a hospital. And it can absorb liquid and maintain its shape.
Can't we do these things even to a lesser degree with paper? My point being, this plastic, let me go a different route. I absolutely don't think the education piece is going to change anything, because you've done a lot of education and we're still getting, is it 30 tonnes a day at one end? So education isn't going to do anything. We buy these things so they're convenient, so that we're going to continue to buy them and treat them in the way we do, just because of the scale involved. So if you're on our side of the counter, what is the answer to stopping this going into the sewer and costing us £12 million a year?
I think we would have to re-emphasise consumer awareness. The market, I don't think, will change to that demand. The consumer demand is there.
But the consumer demand is alive for lots of things that are not particularly beneficial. So I don't see that as a defence. Is there any technological developments that you have as an industry that you think can maintain the luxury end of this, but also help with the disposal end of this?
I'm not aware of technological innovations that will do that.
See, to my mind then, what would you say if I was to say that we should be trying to curtail, reduce, eliminate the use of these products? Because they, from a public point of view, they're just going to be more and more and more, and we are bearing the cost.
Consumers continue to demand the product, and making all these products flushable is counterproductive. It will result in indiscriminate flushing. It's very important that we actually accept that they are here to stay. There are alternatives that can rightly be promoted. There's no question of that, and we would not disagree with that at all. But I have to come back to our point. The answer is education, and we certainly could have done better. We're really looking to improve that and to work with the stakeholders to improve that. We believe that that really is key, and that is something that we're looking at building on, along with Water UK and the other water groups. Also looking at external stakeholders who are trusted influencers who can help inform consumers, maybe at the antenatal stage of a pregnancy, for example, where parents are coming into a new market, if you like. They've got a new baby. They're going to be using lots of things in their house that they haven't used before, not just wipes, but maybe more cotton wool, maybe more cotton buds, maybe all sorts of things that could actually fit down the U-bend and be thought of as flushable, because when you press that button, it disappears, but it doesn't disappear, as we all know. So it's about bringing that piece together and saying to people, the toilet is not a bin. you will suffer personally if you block your toilet, and so will everybody else. And just helping to bring that education piece in. If I may just have a minute, I remember when I had my children a long time ago now, I'm a grandmother now, but I was told in my antenatal classes that I had this sort of soft messaging, and it was about the fact that you're going to have a lot more to wash, a lot more to clean up, you need to learn how to manage all of this and deal with the things that you've not had to deal with before. And I see this as very, very similar. You know, could we bring in groups like the NCT? Could we bring in midwives? Could we bring in other people that that could message about what you do and how you treat your products when you've used them?
Richard, at what level of non-flushables is manageable for you? So in my mind, it costs you 12 million a year. At what point is it negligible? You know, what percentage drop would you need?
It's our job to manage it, but it's expensive. And what we want to do is get that cost right down to zero. If we didn't have any unflushable items, and it's not just wet wipes, people do flush dishcloths. A few years ago, there was a flushable toilet brush was being marketed. I mean, there are all sorts of things that end up on the screens that shouldn't. So I think the basic point about we only want pee-poo and paper, or as somebody once put it, please don't flush it unless you've eaten it first. You know, it's that kind of messaging that we have to get across. So our schools program is really important. And I think the Fatberg campaign has been really helpful in getting the non-flushable message. And we just have to keep going, and it's a joint effort from everybody involved in this. I do have some sympathy for the industry point of view, because if customers keep demanding things, they've got to find some way of supplying them. And what we've got to then do is work together on a campaign saying, by all means use these things, but don't flush them, because this is what happens, and not that. You know, it's pretty basic stuff.
I see your point.
Schools are really important in this, actually.
My worry is that we have an industry that makes a fair amount of money from these products, and we bear some of the cost of producing those products, which I think is a bit of a liberty. Yes, we use them, but I'm pretty sure when I was a baby, wet wipes weren't the thing. There was alternatives. People use them because they're there. I worry if education will make the change on two levels. Who's providing this education and paying for it? And at what level will it stop having any effect, and we just have to bear the cost as the public? That's the point that annoys me. And I don't sense, and forgive me if I'm being difficult, and please correct me, I don't sense an industry forging ahead at trying to remove plastic, which is a whole other thing about the effect it has on the environment, which for me personally is a massive worry. I don't sense there a big energy, someone saying, well, let's remove these things. Part of educating people might be saying, you cannot have these high luxury wipes, you're going to have ones of slightly lower luxury. Is the industry involved in any of those sort of things?
We've been looking at plastics since exactly this time last year. We did a whole meeting last February on plastic, single-use plastic water bottles. So this is something that's been a big concern to this committee, and we've produced a lot of recommendations, and many of which the Mayor has already decided to adopt. And so, you know, we're very interested to see how we can pull out of this discussion the best way to move forward. Now, I've seen Natalie wanted to come in on the issue of how do we reduce the amount of plastics, I think, and I've also seen that Jeanette Arnold wants to come in and ask a question. So if I bring in Natalie and then Jeanette.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just to sort of raise an awareness around, as with the education, and obviously there does need to be education. We just need to be careful around the backfire effect of normalising wipes and flushing, because there has been, you know, I don't know how much of this I'm saying it, you know, an increase in wipes off the back of the Fatberg stories of wipe sales, in, you know, so people are like, oh, everybody's using wipes, so, you know, that's normal. So I think really the education piece needs to be almost behind the scenes, and what we're putting out there publicly is around normalising having a bin. It's normalising reusables, and it's normalising alternatives.
So normalising reusables will be an important part of the picture in terms of reducing the overall number of non-flushable wipes that enter the system. Jeanette, you wanted to come in as well.
Well, yes, Chair, just a couple of comments, if I can, before I ask my question. It was just to say, 18 years ago, I led the Assembly's work and campaign to stop smoking in public places. I was told by interviewers and the brightest and the best that I was daft and it would never happen. We know it can happen. And so I think it's about engaging in saying that it may well be a turning cycle of 10 to 20 years. But of course, if everybody's on the same page, then we can change attitudes, we can change behaviour when we're clear about the message. And it's about costs, and it was to Tracy, again starting with a comment, you talked about having babies. When I had my son many, many years ago, it was regular for that you to get a sponsored baby pack, and that helped you because you were patterned then. That was what was ever in that pack, you went away and bought. So I was using cotton wool until my mother-in-law told me, get a flannel. What have you, you know. And so I think there is room for manufacturers and for industries to look and say, and you have identified it, that point where you can influence and change. I think that's the area that it would be great to see some support from the industry and sponsorship of it. The other thing is, and I don't know if anybody here is of that age, when you bought the baby bath pack, you bought a nappy bucket. Now, it's interesting, over the years, the nappy bucket has disappeared. And so it's, as my colleague says, we've got to change people's way of, it was routine to have a nappy bucket in the bathroom with your other bucket, you know. And so again, we can change behaviours, and what we think is abnormal now become normal. What I think is a big problem is cost. I'm working with some young women now who's running a charity to raise money for other young women who can't afford any sanitary wear, right, because of the cost of them. So is there a commitment in the industry to be saying, if the trend is about increasing flushable, then you'll be looking to make it as economically, you know, not cheap, but be mindful that if you produce a product and it is higher than the one that you'd want people to move away from, that for a huge number of people that's not going to be possible.
Yes, I mean, I'm aware of the sanitary protection campaigns because we do represent the femcare industry and we've been talking to the various charities in relation to that, so taking your points on board there. In terms of wipes and cost, they're not a high cost item particularly, I don't believe, but then for some people they would be. So I guess it's about people having available to them what they can afford to buy and having information about alternatives that may be less expensive. Going back to your earlier point, I think that you're right. I think that this could take some time, and maybe we're making an investment for future years in terms of this education campaign. And I'm thinking back in particular to having watched the recycling efforts finally becoming embedded as the children who started to learn about that became adults and had their own homes. So it might well be that this isn't an overnight turnaround. It'd be lovely if it was. But I agree with you on all of the points that you've made.
So, Seán, is flushable products more expensive at the moment than non-flushable?
It depends on the brand, but generally they are.
They are.
Yeah.
So there's a cross barrier to actually shift from one to the other.
I think it could be perceived that way, absolutely, yeah.
Reusable items
Yeah,
are clearly
reusable,
cheaper
yeah.
because you use them many times.
Initially, they're probably not. But, so just to pick up on a few points that my colleagues made, I don't share my colleagues' enthusiasm for the behaviour change in that it'll take very long. No matter, I think we agree on that. No matter, even if you get 100% behaviour change, it'll take some time. And in that time, we've been adding an awful lot of plastic to our environment, of which wet wipes and these products are particularly guilty. So I think we need to do something about not having them arrive in the first place, rather than trying to educate everybody else not to put them. Because whatever happens, this plastic enters the system somewhere. Even if they don't put it down the sewer, it enters landfill, which is almost equally as awful. And of course, there's a cost. This is one of my main bugbears. There's the cost to the taxpayer. We are, you could argue, if you were cynical, subsidising an industry which isn't taking as much strides as it could to cover the cost of what it's producing. Surely, with such a simple product, with the fact that there is some alternatives, a view could be taken from cradle to grave of this product. because currently you are releasing it into the wild and able to wash your hands of it, other than educating us, which I accept. The public have a great responsibility how they use anything to take care of it, and I don't find that acceptable. I just don't. I'd like to ask the industry, what are you doing to reduce the amount of plastic that you as an industry are putting in our systems, sewer and landfill?
I'm not sure there's any metric that exists to correlate the cost to society for the use of any product. I'm not sure how you would set that up. So I don't know how you would calculate it. I don't know how you would then redistribute those costs. I'm not sure how that would be done.
Fortunately for the industry, I'm a conservative and don't like a tax. But of course, I think the word surcharge has been used. Or at least in the London region, we could point to the 12 million a year it's costing us. I'm going to stop, Chair, because I think I'm beginning to have a moment here. But I just want to make the point that I think this industry should be making strides to point out to people that the plastic-filled end is a luxury item, and you should be asking people to use the paper-fill end, I use crude terms here, which are disposable, which don't clog up the sewer, and you should be pushing those products more because they give the public the utility they want without the damage to the environment and also the cost to the public.
Sorry, just to conclude, Mr. Bailey, please don't stop. The scrutiny is needed to change patterns and to affect positive change.
And I think we've just had a very good example from Jeanette of a really big piece of behaviour change to do with smoking in public places. And of course, we've also got the evidence of what happened. I know you don't like it, but the concept of an extra charge, but adding 5 pence to the cost of buying plastic bags has reduced single-use plastic bag use by 85%. And we're just about to extend it from the larger supermarkets to all. So I feel that there is more work that can be done in this space around behaviour change, and it might need a carrot and stick approach, and it might need some bigger signalling towards the more reusable products becoming a larger proportion of the market. But I'm pretty sure that, you know, it's not beyond the, you know, we've managed to make these amazing products. I think we can make some amazing new products, and we can also shift some of what we're doing away from where we are at the moment. However, a fatberg is not just made up of wet wipes. And so we're now going to talk a little bit about the other half of what makes a fatberg, which is the fat. We've got our map of what can only be described as some hotspots, I think, and I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member David Curtin, who's going to lead the questioning on this area.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start off with Thames Water. Richard, if I could ask you, how can fats be prevented from clogging London sewers?
It comes down to behaviour change. So first of all, we're working hard with individual customers, persuading them that just because when you wash up and you use some washing up liquid and it's all nice and warm and soapy and it all looks as though it's gone away, as soon as it goes down the sink and gets cold again, it very quickly reconstitutes itself as fat, and you can very quickly create your own blockage outside your own house or your neighbour's house if you're not very careful. So we do make fat traps available to people, big education campaign with individual consumers, and of course we're the only utility really where our customers actually operate part of the system. I mean, every decision they take to turn on a tap, what they flush down the toilet, what they put down the sink, that's actually our problem to deal with. So there's a big education piece here. But the other part of it is the food service establishments. And the issue there is about grease and oil that gets down the sewer. In some cases, we've had people in the past tipping waste oil down the sewer. That happens less often than it used to. And there are collection schemes being devised that will help that. But it's also just about all the grease from everything that gets cooked. So we did a survey of 1,000 food service establishments, and 90% did not have effective grease management processes in place. And that's not just a wastewater problem, it's also a fire hazard. So we work to educate. So we have a pack here, Protecting Your Business, explaining how food service establishments can fit proper grease traps, and then how to maintain them, service them, and make sure they're effective. We do have powers to enforce that, if need be, but we'd much rather work through education. So we do a series of visits. The first visit to explain what the problem is, and then we go back and check, and then we go back again. So gradually we can get tougher with people if they're not following the rules. part of the problem there is that some food service establishments change hands quite quickly, so you're constantly re-educating people. And that's a process we have to do more and more of. And we work very closely with council environmental health officers, although some local authorities have had budget cuts and there aren't as many EHOs as there used to be. So we have to take on more of the responsibility for that. But it comes down to a constant education campaign.
Okay. So you said about 90% of sort of food outlets or groups that work with food, restaurants and so on are substandard. So do you think it's a widespread practice?
35,000 food service establishments registered across London roughly, and we did a survey of 1,000. So a pretty good representative survey, and 90% did not have what we regarded as efficient measures to trap fats, oils and greases. And it wasn't only at the bottom end of the market, this was at all levels, just sheer lack of awareness. And very often when it was pointed out to people, they were very happy to do what was required.
Okay, yeah. Do you, Edward,
So this is where Edward's
you're involved in the industry? So.
Yeah, I think grease is the issue that binds everything together. That's the problem. I mean, we work with some of the UK's leading groups and operators, and they are proactive, but I think if a restaurant's over 10 years old, chances are it hasn't got a grease separator, and so grease is going straight to the drain, and that is the problem.
So you mentioned grease, and we've got like fats, oil and grease. What's the difference between oil and grease and fat? Is grease more of an issue than
fat, oil and grease is the product derived from washing pots and pans that gets into the drainage system. So that's what's causing the fatberg.
Okay, right. And are there specific hotspots in London where this is more of an issue? And are there any reasons why there might be specific hotspots where there are a higher incidence of blockages and so on?
I mean, you've got a map in your folder which shows the areas marked red of where we have the most blockages. It's a number of factors. It's
like East London is a bit of a hotspot to me, according to this.
It's the number of food service establishments in a concentrated area, and it's also got something to do with the size of the sewers. So what we do is we record this, and I've got actually a list of borough by borough of blockages for fats, oils and greases. And Hounslow...
Would you be able to supply that to the committee?
Yes,
because I'm sure some of our colleagues who are not here today might be represented, obviously all of London, either geographically or London-wide, but I think others might be interested if you do have that broken down by borough. That would be great if you could supply that to us afterwards. Thank you, Richard.
So you mentioned that the food service outlet and food service establishments before. Does that include takeaways and things? Okay, right.
Where food is prepared, you're likely to get some grease, and that then needs to be managed properly. Otherwise, it goes down the drains and causes blockages.
Okay. I see from the map it looks like there's some hot spots around Hounslow and also Bexley, which is a...
Hounslow and Bexley are both high up on the blockage list. And it's to do with the number of food service establishments and how close together they are, but it is also to do with the size of the sewers. So you may find that in those areas there's slightly smaller sewers, so they block more often. But then, by monitoring that, we can then target our education activities more closely on those boroughs.
Yeah. I mean, as far as you're concerned, I mean, with the sewer out pipes and so on, have you got any plans to widen the sewers in some of those areas? Is that part of the strategy?
It's very expensive to do. I mean, the sewers are in good condition, so we would only widen them if they needed to take more flow, either foul flow or in the combined areas, surface water. When there are new developments, then yes, we do build additional sewerage capacity. But it doesn't really make sense to be digging up roads and replacing perfectly serviceable sewers just because people are putting grease and wet wipes down them. We'd much rather be used properly. And we also stepped up our cleaning. We do proactive cleaning. We did about 100 miles of sewer last year, going through, looking for put CCTV cameras down to see whether these, just the odd tree root that gets instantly creates something that can start to build a blockage. So we do that in areas where there's perhaps the sewer dips a bit and it begins to silt up. We'll get in and jet that out and keep them as clean flowing as we can. But as I say, it's the things that people put down them. And it's not just actually fats, oils and greases. We find everything from concrete to traffic cones to bedspreads, all sorts of things end up in the sewer. And it's just a constant job to get them out.
Trying to stick with the fats,
Sorry.
the oils and the grease for now, because I don't think there's much. Hopefully you're not finding too many traffic cones. Just following on from what David was saying, can I just ask you, you're saying that these particular hotspots are created in some cases by smaller sewers, and I think we've explored that might be impractical to just enlarge. Are there particular types of cuisine or different types of food outlet that are more prone to creating larger amounts of fat that could be focused on by Thames Water in terms of that education process? I mean, are fast food outlets, for example, more prone to, more fat in the drain than others?
I think it's difficult to generalise, but certainly the more fat that they use in the cooking, the more is likely to get into the drains. And when I talk about the smaller size of the sewers, it's more about that particular network may just be more likely to block. So we're just the way we do it is to monitor where the blockages are, and then target the campaigns locally to make sure we get the maximum impact. So you've got the overarching sort of fatberg type awareness raising. You've got the very focused area on food service establishments. Plus, you've got the individual customer education, so you're trying to hit all the constituent parts of the problem.
Okay, what about sort of enforcement and rules? And what rules and laws are there to try to prevent people from putting fats and oils and greases down the drain? So what enforcement measures can you take, and what enforcement measures can local councils take?
We and local authorities both have enforcement powers. We prefer not to use those powers. We'd much rather educate people. But we did have one, actually it was a food manufacturer that blocked sewers consistently despite warnings, and they were taken to court and they were fined. And we will do that if we need to, if they've genuinely caused a significant problem in the sewers, but we'd much rather work with education. It's much more effective.
Was this for someone who was consistent? You said did it over and over and over again?
They did it twice. In each case, it put a small sewage works out of action. This was just outside London, and they went to court and were fined. So we have the powers, and when we're talking to people, we can say, look, at the last resort, we will take you to court. But it's much better to work with persuasion.
Yeah. Okay. And you talk about education. You brought in something, the fat trap there. Something. Is that what else do you do to try to seek to educate people, and how does your education program work for
works at various levels. It works via the media. I mean, the fatberg has been marvellous because it's given us a huge amount of free publicity for the message, and Evening Standard have been really helpful in pushing stories. But then it's a question of and certainly the results from that have been very good. So 2/3 of Londoners are aware of the problem, which was a big increase. We then have to build on that by getting the specific behaviour change. So things like a fat trap, there's a little plastic scraper in here so you can scrape the fat out of a roasting tin rather than you've got to make it easy for people. That's the first thing. There's also schools education. We have stuff on our websites. When we talk to customers, we would try and, when we go around and do water efficiency visits, for instance, we'll also talk about what to put down the sewers. So we're using every opportunity to try and reinforce the messages.
With all of these kind of education programs, I mean, they're fantastic, but I do find sometimes that you get 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the people. I mean, so there's like a hardcore of people that you can't reach or just won't change their behaviour, are sort of immune to education messaging, just simply don't care, even if you talk about fatbergs. What can you do about those people? What can you do about...
We've got to identify them. So if we've got a blockage in a housing estate, which is the house that's flushing the nappies that they shouldn't be flushing? Which is the one who's regularly putting oil and grease down the sink? If you've got a row of food service establishments, 8, 10 in a row sometimes in a street, which one is it that's actually got the worst behaviour? So if you can pinpoint it, then obviously you can use much firmer persuasion. But more generally, it's just about educating and making it easy for people. If you can explain to people how they can fit a grease trap and how it will work, and that actually it's good for their business, then that's why this is called protecting your business, because you're protecting them from flooding their own kitchen in many cases.
I think there's a lack of understanding. I think putting grease in a waste oil receptacle as opposed to down the drain, it's a behavioural change. So we have two elements. We've got good practice and then fitting a grease separator. And I think for a lot of customers, they don't understand the difference between the two, and it's actually educating them with regard to that.
And also from a sustainability point of view, I think when people do that separation, it can also sometimes be then transformed for use as some sort of fuel as well.
Absolutely.
Because I know some people who've done that in large kitchens where there is a lot of fat being used, and obviously that's we would encourage people to reuse in that way rather than just sticking it down the drain. Tracy, did you want to come in as well?
A very quick comment to build on yours, Richard. having watched the recycling efforts over the years and all the initiatives that local authorities have exercised, such as incentive schemes and refunds on tax and so on and so forth, the one thing that DEFRA found worked, and the only thing that worked, was making it easy for people to do it. Nothing else worked.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We're now going to draw this part of our examination of the issues relating to water and London to a slight pause, and we're going to thank Seán, Tracy, Edward and Natalie for their contribution. We're going to retain Richard and Karen. We're also going to retain Richard's lovely bottles of disintegrating toilet paper and not disintegrating wet wipe, and we're going to bring in our new guests. So thank you very much to Tracy, Seán, Edward and Natalie. We're going to have a slight pause.
GLA, chamber, sound. 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 GLA, chamber, sound.
Right, I'd just like to restart the February meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee, and we've just been talking about fatbergs with Thames Water and a number of other guests. We're now going to move on to the really important issue of water supply and demand over the next 80 years, so looking out to 2100, and then coming back to the thorny issue, which we have discussed with Thames Water previously, of the situation with regard to burst water mains and action that's being taken to move ahead on that particular challenge, which has been continuing for Londoners. I'm now going to introduce our new guests, who are Daniel Bicknell, who's the Policy and Programme Officer from the Greater London Authority. Karen Gibbs, who's from the Consumer Council for Water, has stayed on. Thank you, Karen. Richard Aylard from Thames Water, who's also stayed on. Timothy Mcmahon, who's the head of water networks at Thames Water, in case we have any particular technical issues to be thrown at the panel. And then finally, last but not least, we've got Paul Matthews from Transport for London. So presumably when we get to that interface between digging up the road to deal with the burst water mains and the challenges that that places on Transport for London. But we'll come to the burst water mains after we've picked up on the issue of the 2100 plan and how we're looking forward to dealing with water supply and demand for our growing city. And one of the things, Richard, I just wanted to start off with at this point, obviously we're now faced with another major city in the world that appears to have allowed untrammeled growth to take place in terms of housing and is facing potentially having standpipes and no water available at all in Cape Town in South Africa. And in that context, I just wondered if you could start by giving us an overview in terms of how we plan to balance London's supply and demand, because clearly they don't seem to have got that quite right in Cape Town.
All water companies are required to have a 25-year statutory water resource management plan, and we publish a new one every 5 years, and we've just put our draft plan out for consultation. But whereas the guidance used to say you need to plan for 25 years. If you've got a really good reason to plan for longer, well, okay, you'll have to explain yourself. This time the rules have been changed. And they now say plan for whatever period you think is appropriate for the area you serve and your customers, so long as it's at least 25 years. And looking at London's growth and the risks around supplying the capital, we've gone for an 80-year plan. Now, bearing in mind we're going to be redoing it every 5 years, it at least sets out an 80-year vision. The other thing we've done differently in this plan is that previously we've sort of produced the plan behind closed doors and then presented to people to say, what do you think? That clearly wasn't the best way to do it. So we've spent the last 3 years actually having a whole series of very open forum discussions with our stakeholders to decide what ought to be in the plan and to explain to them the work we were doing, and they've critiqued the studies. And I'm pleased to say that the GLA have been very attended virtually every meeting and have commented on a number of aspects of it. So this plan's been created very much more openly, and it has now been published. And we think that that will have sufficient in it to protect London against the kind of fate that's fallen Cape Town. Now, if we could guarantee the same population and the same climate for the next 80 years, all we'd need to do is keep getting leakage down. But of course we can't. We know climate change is going to kick in even more than it has already, and we know we're going to have to deal with about another 2 million people by 2045. And that's the equivalent of Birmingham and Glasgow's populations all moving to London. So it's a big challenge, and we've set out in the draft plan how we think that should best be done to give best value to our customers.
Well, thank you for setting that out as the start to this part of the discussion. I'm going to now call on my colleague Joanne McCartney to now come in with some further questions around the supply and demand management for the future.
Yeah, I mean, in 2006, I led a report on drought in London. So at that stage, we were talking about the possibility of standpipes being put in. The streets, and obviously, as you stated, with an increasing population and the risk of drought, I think Water UK has done some recent work saying that there's a 1 in 5 chance that we'll have drought again in any potential year for the next 25 years. So can I just ask, do you think your plans are bold enough? And will we see something short term rather than an 80-year?
We recognise that from time to time we're going to need to put on some kind of restrictions on our customers, and we know that customers will accept the imposition of a hosepipe ban in the sort of drought we'd expect to get 1 year in 20. As it happens, we had to have a ban in 2006 and again in 2012. But the really important thing is to make sure that we don't get to emergency measures. And the chance of that at the moment is it's about a 1 in 125-year drought that would potentially put us into requiring emergency measures. It wouldn't probably actually be standpipes in the street, because can you imagine people queuing in, Canary Wharf or Parliament Square? It's just not going to work. So we have to have a really good plan. What we're trying to do is get our resilience over time up from 1 in 125 years to 1 in 200. So it would be a really severe drought, very severe indeed before we started to get into requiring emergency measures, and that's in our plan. And how we want to do it is the next few years are mainly about managing demand. We can get leakage down further, and we can get it down much faster. We can fit a lot more meters, and we can help our customers to use water wisely. But in the longer term, we're also going to need more water. We can't do it all through demand management because of what's coming at us in terms of population and climate change. And our draft plan sets out for consultation very clearly what we think we need to do, both in the next few years and further ahead. And if I talk specifically about leakage, I mean, there's a challenge from Ofwat, which has been picked up by the Secretary of State in the White Paper, which says that all water companies should be looking to get leakage down by 15% over the next 5 years. We were originally planning to get 15% reduction over 3 5-year periods. We've actually brought it forward, so we're going to do it over 1. So leakage is going to be a really even more of a focus for us in the next 5 years than it is at the moment. And of course, having missed a leakage target, we've got to get back on track and get the extra 15%. So there's a huge amount to be done there. And that coupled with the metering programme and enhanced water efficiency. One of the things we've been doing is, before we fit people with a meter on a compulsory basis, we go around and talk to them about water efficiency. Not surprisingly, that's when they're most receptive. We do what we call smarter home visits. We actually go and knock on the door, groundwork who are our partners, talk to people about how to use water wisely. They give them water efficient tap inserts, low flow shower heads, all the things that they can use to help them use water sensibly. And a combination of leakage, water efficiency and metering means we can keep getting demand down, and it's only later in the period that we have to start bringing in the extra supply options.
Okay, can I ask Karen, perhaps, are you satisfied that Thames Water's doing all that they can, or is there something they should be? And in that report, which was, 10 years ago, we suggested that the Consumer Council might want to evaluate each of the water companies' conservation campaigns and give advice or rate them. Is that something that you do, that sort of evaluation?
Yes, we've worked very hard to ensure that the companies in the South East, particularly those with compulsory metering programmes, have had very extensive water efficiency campaigns and support packages to complement the metering itself. We've also made sure that where, like in the southeast, where the water situation is very stressed, that the companies have been working together as well, because there are lots of these issues that do suggest that customer awareness and education is an important part of that process. And so, improving in that respect is another important element. I think in terms of whether Thames is doing enough, it's really important that Thames's plans reflect the priorities of its customers. And this is why we've encouraged Thames, along with all the other companies, to really seize the opportunity to do really effective customer engagement and research, to understand, what customers' priorities are, and where they support investment in demand management, new water resources, that they're also comfortable with the pace of investment as well, because at the end of the day, the services need to be affordable for customers today and in the future.
Is there evidence that, because I believe a group of my residents actually challenging Thames Water and saying that there's no legal obligation to take a water meter, but is there evidence to show that actually putting water meters in would reduce water use and therefore bills, because that's what customers are concerned about?
Certainly there's evidence to date from the programmes that have run ahead of the Thames water metering programme that it is delivering savings in the amount of water that companies are having to put out into distribution. How much is attributed to putting the meter in, and what else the company has done to help customers use less water, so through help with repairing supply pipe leakage, the audits to help the household consider how much water they're using and maybe change behaviour, is quite difficult to disaggregate. But the programmes themselves are certainly delivering results in terms of reducing water demand. What I would say is an important element in that demand balance is the effort that the companies make in reducing leakage. You know, at the level of a company's leakage is often a barrier to customers accepting the need to be more efficient themselves. And so it's really important that the company has a really comprehensive approach to demand management before it considers then delivering new water resources.
And Richard, can I ask you, do you have evidence that actually when you put meters in, customers' fears that their bills will go up are unfounded?
We've done a lot of analysis of the results from companies that were ahead of us in doing metering, and we forecast about a 16% reduction in usage from customers who have a meter fitted on a compulsory basis. So
that's usage, but obviously water rates are a flat rate per year, irrespective of the amount of people in, and I can imagine low-income families may be particularly concerned. And as the daughter of 2 teenage girls,
well, yes,
you know, it's like their showers. It's, you know, so, you know, do you have evidence that actually it doesn't put customers' bills up? Because I think at the end of the day, for customers to want to come forward and take those meters.
Done a lot of work on analysis of what it does to bills, and there are a few customers, those who were in low rateable value properties with a large number of people living in the house who are not using water carefully, their bills will go up a lot. If you've got an elderly couple living in a 4 or 5 bedroom house on their own, their bills will come down quite dramatically. But for the vast majority of people, the bills are very similar, actually, under a meter. Just a little bit above, the same, a little bit below. The curve has a lot in the middle. But the important thing is that once people have had the help and they've fitted the water efficient devices, just about everybody can actually get their bill down. Some people have to work harder at it than others, but it's our job to work with them, give them all the support we possibly can. And the other thing we do is we phase in so that they before they get their first metered bill, they get at least a year where they're being told what that bill would be, so they can work out, you know, that they can change immediately if they would save money, but if the bill's going to go up, they've got time to adjust their behaviour before they actually get their first metered bill that they need to pay.
There is a transition period.
There is a transition, yes. They're aware of what it's going to be before it actually arrives.
And in the past, I think we've talked about vulnerable families. Do you offer any schemes for those who are particularly on low incomes?
Yes, we've got a number of schemes. The first thing we would say is...
they shouldn't be afraid.
No.
That's what
Anybody who has trouble with paying their water bill, please pick up the phone and talk to us, because there's lots and lots of things we can do to help, ranging from, in some cases, a social tariff, where they'll actually get their whole bill reduced by up to half, through to advice on water efficiency. We even have a charitable trust that can help. So there's a lot of measures, but the main thing for us is just to know that that particular customer has got a problem.
One of your long-term plans is obviously a new reservoir. I think 10 years ago, you raised it with us. I think it had been on the table then for quite a while. Is that actually, is that really just a really long-term goal, or is it something that you think you were going to move ahead with very quickly?
The things can change. For instance, the amount of water that we need to supply to other companies in the area. We've had one discussion with the companies. We transfer water amongst ourselves quite a lot. So we've got an initial forecast from those companies of how much they would need. But if they need more water, it could potentially bring our need for a big resource forwards. If they need less, it could go backwards. If population growth is faster or slower than predicted, or if the Environment Agency's requirements for us to reduce our existing abstractions go forwards or backwards. But at the moment, we think that in the mid-2040s, we're going to need a big new source of water in the form of a reservoir. And the point that has been around since the 1990s as a plan. There's only one really good site that we can use, and we're keen to safeguard that. But the way it would work is we'd take water from the River Thames in the winter, when the river's flowing high, store it, and then in the summer when we need it, we can supply the local area, bearing in mind Oxfordshire, Swindon, Banbury is all growing very fast as well. But we put most of it back in the river. It flows down to London under gravity, just in the river. We abstract it at a normal abstraction point. So we're moving water that falls on the wetter west down into the south and east, on a sort of gravity-powered conveyor belt using the river, so you're not having to pump, which is really important. But the other thing is, once that water's in the River Thames, we can abstract it, but so can all the other companies that abstract from the Thames. So it could become a resource for Affinity Water, South East Water, Sutton and East Surrey. It becomes a regional resource. There's a lot of work being done through what's called the Water Resources in the South East Group, working out how we can most effectively share water between companies. Because as Karen says, customers want companies to work together, move water around where it makes sense, and come up with the best overall regional solution. And that's what we're all trying to do through this group that's been working away to find a big integrated plan.
So that's on the table, that's useful. Can I just ask finally, Daniel, from the GLA's perspective on the supply and demand and how you balance that, is there anything that the GLA has been suggested to Thames Water that they're not doing?
I think we're broadly supportive. I mean, we've been quite clear on the balance between sort of supply and demand. I mean, the priority has to be focused on demand management first and maximising that, recognising that London's per capita consumption figures are still stubbornly high. They're coming down, so there's more that can be done on that. And clearly, leakage. We've talked about leakage. Leakage is a really important part of that, and we're pushing quite hard on that, particularly on the mains burst side. And we can talk a bit more about that later on. But in the draft environment strategy, we do recognise that however hard you push demand management, and more needs to happen there is still a need for a new regional resource for London, and that's not just something that Thames Water are calling for, it's something that all the water companies that supply London are actually calling for. So we recognise that need is there, and it should be the solution that's delivered should be the best solution for London and Londoners. So we're doing a kind of complementary piece of work, I suppose. We're not trying to redo any of the detailed analysis that Thames Water have done to support their water resource management plan. But we are looking to carry out, or have started carrying out, an assessment of the water resource management plan supply options, just to assess how they impact on Londoners specifically, different parts of London, different mayoral priorities as well. So looking at some of the more social elements, I suppose, of the different supply options, if you like. So, does a new reservoir or does a new effluent reuse scheme have a disproportionate impact on certain demographics or parts of London? So it's understanding that broader picture, not wanting to redo any of Thames Water's kind of detailed work.
Thank you.
Keith, I'm going to bring you in for your group of questions, but before I bring you in, I think David Kirkham was indicating that you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something you said, Richard, and about the population projections. I mean, you said you thought there might be an extra 2 million people by 2045. I just wonder if that's an underestimate based on the way the population has been growing over the past 20 years. We've had over 2 million people increase in London's population since 1997. So if that's extrapolated, it's getting the rate of increase is getting larger. So wouldn't you expect more like 3 million people or more by 2045 rather than 2 million?
The answer is that forecasting is really difficult. Forecasting population has not gone well in the past. In general,
it's far more than
but
people have said in the past.
What we have done is we've done what we're required to do in our plan, which is to use the official figures which the GLA use. And we've also had various academics looking at them and trying to break it down into smaller areas and then re-aggregate it and see whether there's double counting. There's a lot of work going on at the moment to try and get really good forecasts. But the important thing is that the plan gets redone every 5 years. So we want the best view of the future now, and we'll be revisiting that regularly. And the important point is we have enough headroom that even if population grows up quite sharply, we should be able to cope. So we build headroom into our plans. The further into the future you go, the more headroom there is. So,
I mean, like the most recent figure, for example, the mid-year to June 2016, London's population went up in 1 year by 135,000. Which is far more, if year by year, if that's replicated, you say over the next 27 years to 2045, if that's replicated year on year, London's population won't grow by 2 million, it will grow by 3.6 million. No. So that's nearly double your projection. So with your forecasts and, talking about, your meat water needs with a 15% reduction in leakage, a 15% reduction in consumer use. I mean, that's not going to come true if the population is going to go up far more than you're projecting.
You're quite right, and London has grown faster than predicted over the current five-year period. But as I say, we are using the best available forecasts, and we do build headroom into our plans, so we have got time to adapt, because the future will never be exactly as we predicted. In one sense, why wouldn't we generate huge amounts of additional water? Well, the answer is it would be very expensive for our customers, and we could be spending money that doesn't need to be spent. So you've got to get the balance right here. So the important point is to make sure we've got time to adapt if the future doesn't turn out to be quite the way we expect.
As a matter of interest, Daniel, do you concur from the GLA side with the Thames water projections in terms of population, or are we somewhere else on the page in the GLA?
I probably wouldn't want to comment too much on the detail, but I've been party to the sessions that have looked at how they're calculating population projections. It is extremely complicated, and I support the approach that they've taken several views on it, including the academic view, and there is some discrepancy between the two, but I think you're trying to build that into your projection. So broadly in support.
So with the 5-year reviews of the plan, you don't envisage that London is going to run out of water, as seems to be happening in Cape Town, for example?
Well, I think maybe that's a slightly different question around the resilience and drought measures. From that point of view, again, we're kind of supportive of Ofwat's view and the approach that the majority of water companies are taking and moving from a 1 in 125 year level of resilience to a 1 in 200 year level of resilience to ensure that London will always have some form of restrictions when droughts happen, and droughts will happen, but the ones we're trying to avoid, as Richard says, are those extreme drought measures that are really disruptive and expensive for London. And we think moving towards that high level of resilience is a good way of doing, important way of doing that.
David,
just one final question. We have different estimates of London's current population. What do you put London's current population as using?
I have to write to you about this, Chair. I don't think I can just give figures off the top of my head. I mean, I can talk about. We can write to you about the process that we've used and how the numbers have been generated. I think that's perhaps the best way. It is, as Daniel says, we've had some very long and very complicated sessions with the academics looking at this, and we do account for it in two ways. One is by looking at scenarios. So, if London grew faster, would this plan be resilient? And secondly, by building in headroom. So we are always trying to make sure that we've got time to adapt if things turn out differently, as they will.
I believe that the mostly accepted figure is 8.8 million for current population. Keith Prince is going to ask our next set of questions. Thank you for that, David. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you. Before I start, though, I'd like to actually just revisit metering for a minute, if that's okay. Talking from personal experience, actually, I've spent a lot of time living in flats, and I had a flat in Ilford, and I had that on the meter, and I was very happy with that. I then moved to another flat, which was a maisonette, I think they call it.
Just before we enter into the long description of how many flats you've lived in, just behind you is the Tudor Primary School, who've come all the way from Ealing to listen to you. So should we give them a wave?
Hello.
So today we're talking about water with Thames Water, and we're trying to talk about plans for the future. So in 80 years' time, how much water might we need? How much water might we be using? And you've just missed us having a discussion about the other thing that Thames Water deals with, which is what goes into the sewers. And we talked about fatbergs and people putting the wrong thing down the toilet, and also the amount of grease and fat that comes out of people's kitchens and goes down the sink, or possibly also from restaurants. But now we're just talking about water and making sure we've got enough water for the next 80 years. So that's where we are. Keith, coming back to you.
Thank you. I won't restart. So the second flat I had...
No, I missed it, Keith. Yes, please start again.
He was on his third flat, do you know?
No, I'm on my second flat. So the second, or maisonette, didn't have a water meter. And because I'm quite frugal with water, I don't even have it in my whiskey.
Oh dear.
I asked for a water meter to be fitted, and I was refused for some technical reason, which meant that I was then paying, which is quite the reverse of what you were saying, I was then paying twice as much for my water. Now, I don't expect you to give me a refund, but what can be done in those situations?
There are certain properties that we can't meter, particularly in blocks of flats, because often they were built with all the kitchens connected up one side of the property and bathrooms connected up the other.
So we're only talking about 2 hereditaries.
All right. Well, there would have been a reason why we technically couldn't fit a meter. In those circumstances, what we should have offered you is what's called the assessed household charge, and that is based on an average of what a metered customer would be paying for a property of that size. If we didn't offer you that, I'm sorry, but that would have got your bill down to an average metered charge.
So I was done then, because I had evidence of how much water I'd used the previous year.
Yeah.
And clearly...
I'm happy to look at it afterwards, but I mean, as Karen knows, there is this assessment. There is a mechanism to address exactly that problem.
I'm not doing personal pleading, but I'm just making the case for the people of London. Basically.
But if anybody's watching and has been offered a meter and hasn't been offered the assessed household charge when we can't fit one, then they should contact us and we'll look at it.
Could you send me the details so I can actually,
absolutely.
Get that out to the people in Highbury and Redbridge?
That would be really helpful, Richard, because I think the point that Keith is making is something that comes up a lot with councillors as well as with assembly members, with people saying, I wanted a water meter, I live in a block of flats and I was told I couldn't have one. So some information about what we can tell people in those circumstances would be really helpful for all of us.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so now back to where we were. You can go and tell your mums and dads that, you see, that's helpful. Right, so looking at the long term, really, and London's water needs, clearly you've got some options which we've already discussed, so we don't need to go through that again. But what do you think will be the environmental impact of those changes that you need to make?
It depends which resource option we choose. I mean, the GLA environment strategy talks about the need for a big new resource for London. As Daniel says, they're now looking at what those might be. There are coming in various categories. I mean, you've got the potential for a big new reservoir. We've got potential for water transfers from other parts of the country. And we've got potential for reuse of treated sewage effluent. And we've got desalination. And some of those have high costs to build, but low costs to operate, like the reservoir. Others have relatively low costs to build, like the desalination plant, but incredibly expensive to operate. So the environmental impacts are different for each of those options. And that's one of the things we've looked at in the plan. That's what we're asking our customers about. Do you agree with us? Here's our best homework. What do you think? And it's a genuine consultation, and there'll then be a revised plan coming out in the autumn.
So the point there really is, if we can manage on less, it's actually a double bubble bonus, because it won't, by providing more, it's not just the fact that you have to provide more, there's also environmental costs linked to that as well.
We should always take as little water as we possibly can from the environment and make best use of it.
Moving on to my mum's house now.
How many has she had?
I was going to say, are we going to do the whole family?
No, she only had the one, and that's
okay.
this one. And, anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up,
I don't think we've quite got time for the whole family.
No, indeed, and she's dead now, so she doesn't mind. But her house is one of those 1930s built in Romford or Hornchurch, where the drainage comes from the roof straight into the mains sewer. Now, I know that's a real problem because that gives us a lot more volume, and in many ways also increases the amount of mixed sewage that goes in. So what can we do to reduce that?
Well, what's happened there is Romford and other large parts of London have a combined sewer system. That's the way they were built, to take the surface runoff and the foul drainage through the same pipes, which means you need quite big pipes. And it means your biggest problem in terms of flow is the rainfall and not the foul flow that comes from the houses. So as far as possible, we want to intercept the surface flow and not get it into the sewers. But that is actually quite difficult, particularly in heavily built up areas. So we are doing some work. We've been looking at retrofitting sustainable drainage in some densely populated areas of West London. And we've used permeable road surfaces, we've used swales, everything to try and slow the water down. We can cope with it in the sewers, we can't cope with it all at once. That's when the problems occur. But retrofitting this sustainable drainage is really expensive and complicated. So what we prefer to do is to make sure that all new developments have really good sustainable drainage. So if you go to the Westfield shopping centre, for instance, in West London, it has 2 huge tanks underground. So all the rain off the roof and the car parks drains into those tanks, and it's released into the sewers over a period of days and weeks, so that you don't get these great peaks of flow.
Couldn't they do what we do here, like we reuse it, we put it down
You
the,
could,
down the
and
loops?
that would be even better still, yes. I mean, that when the Millennium Dome was built, it was built with full grey water reuse, and we did a lot of monitoring on it and got a lot of evidence. But I'm afraid when the new building owners came in, they said it all looked a bit complicated and ripped it all out.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, you are up against sometimes the economics, facilities, building managers, but what we want to try and do is make sure that new build in particular is built to really high standards of sustainable drainage, because we can make these areas green and attractive. So, for instance, the Old Oak Park Royal development area, there is an integrated water management strategy which will see the water captured. It will create pleasant green areas around the buildings, and it will stop flows or slow down flows into a problem area of sewers. But it's got to be built in at the start.
So do you think this is something that should be emphasised in the new London plan?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that one of the responses from the Environment Committee, which will be collated together with the other committees, is to say that integrated water management strategies should have more prominence in the London plan. So that's going to be part of our response.
If I could just say as well, sorry, it's one thing to have a strategy, it's another thing to follow it. So we hope it will be well policed and enforced.
well, we're hoping it's going to be a strong policy, not just in the commentary part of the plan.
So,
sorry,
Daniel, do you want to come in on that?
I was only just going to say in the draft London plan that's we published just before Christmas, it has a beefed up policy in that area, and the drainage hierarchy that's been a success actually as part of the outgoing plan. We've seen a huge improvement. It's not perfect. We've seen probably more tanks than we would like and less green sort of SUD systems, but it's still been quite successful in new developments in increasing the attenuation of those. But the drainage hierarchy in the new plan is improved. We think it will continue to ensure that we see an increase in attenuation of surface water, but with greener sustainable drainage solutions. So green and blue roofs, more rain gardens encouraged, and then failing over to tanks if additional capacity is required.
And there are some really good models of how this can be done. I mean, some boroughs are better at it than others, but Enfield's particularly good. A lot of really good green sustainable drainage schemes, which I'm very happy to take any of the committee to see if they were interested. Some really good models of what can be done.
Is it Furlands in Enfield?
Yes.
Yes, which I think is just opened, and we've also got the Walthamstow wetlands, and the Woodbury wetlands. So we are starting to develop a number of these areas that can capture the rainfall and stop the sort of, the large amounts flowing into the system. Sorry, Keith, you want to carry on?
That's fine. So finally, and I can't think of any connection to any of my relatives on this one, I'm afraid. Energy recovery from sewage. How can we help? How can we help London become more carbon neutral?
I'm really pleased you asked that question. We've been recovering energy from sewage sludge since the 1930s with a process called anaerobic digestion. And that typically gets less than 40% of the potential energy content out of the sludge. We've now been fitting a front end called thermal hydrolysis, which is a sort of a pressure cooker that makes the sludge give more energy when you digest it. And that gets you to about 50% of the available amount of energy from the sludge. The next stage would be what's called pyrolysis. The problem has always been that the sludge has been too wet to go through the pyrolysis process without being dried first, and you use more energy in drying it than you get out of it. But a few years ago, we were looking at how we could reduce the volume of sewage sludge that we take out after it's been digested to farmland, because it's mostly water, so you're moving lots of this really heavy stuff around in tankers, which makes no sense. So we talked to the cider industry, and they showed us something called a buka press. And a buka press is what they use to get the last juice out of every apple to make cider.
Cider out of it then?
Yeah. So we reworked with them this cider press as a sewage press.
Oh, right.
And that gets the water content down from 90% to less than 60%, which is great for taking stuff out to farmland because you need less lorries, less fuel, less pollution. But it also makes pyrolysis viable. Now, pyrolysis, what you do is you take the digested sludge, you squeeze it through the buka press, and then you cook it in a vacuum. And that gives you a whole lot more gas, which you can use for energy. So you then get about 90% total of the energy recovered. But also what you've done is you've massively reduced the volume of what's left. So what you've got is it's only 1/10 of the previous volume. And that can then actually, it's so concentrated, it can actually be mined. So you can recover phosphates, you can recover metals, you can recover carbon. So you've actually created a circular economy in which you start off with sewage sludge and you end up with water, energy, and resource. And we've done a small-scale pilot on this, and that worked. So we're now building a full-scale plant, which is going to take a waste stream of 500,000 people's waste. So it's the size of quite a big sewage works, and this is actually at Crossness, which is across the river from Beckton. And that plant is being built now, and it's going to be the first 100% sewage sludge pyrolysis plant. It takes a bit of time, I suspect, to get it working, because these things are pretty technical. But if that does work, we'll then do that on a bigger scale elsewhere, and it will make a big difference in terms of carbon.
Do you think you'll be doing that at Beckton?
For the benefit of our guests up there, 500,000 people's waste is actually 500,000 people's poo, but Richard is too polite to use the word poo.
Yeah.
It's about the size of 2 boroughs, isn't it? Roughly.
500,000, no, I think that's probably slightly more, isn't it, than 2 boroughs?
Not my 2 boroughs are around about that.
And we think that will produce enough energy to power about 2,000 homes. So,
wow.
you know, it's...
And so with the Buka press, that's mechanical
It's a mechanical press, yeah. And
so the amount of energy used is quite low.
Quite low, yes.
And so what do you actually have to put into the process at that point to get the heat up so that the pyrolysis can start to occur in the vacuum?
What you do is you have to heat it, you have to heat your first batch, but then as you produce waste heat, that then heats, pre-cooks the next batch. So you're using some of the heat from the process to make sure that what you're putting in is dry enough.
So it only uses input heat to commence the
That's right, to get
reaction
it going.
in the first place.
Once it's going, it becomes self-sustaining. So it's all these points which is where the technical work's required, because this is much more technical than anything we've ever had in our sewage works before. So we're going to need different people, different training, different equipment. But we're confident enough to be building a plant of this size to give it a real good go. I'm very happy to take you to see it when it's up and running in a year or so's time.
Well, I suspect that might also be of considerable interest to the committee as well. Keith, are you finished in your questions?
Yeah, I think unless there's something over.
Because I think I saw Seán wanted to come in at this point.
I just want to ask a short question on desalination, because I worry that our population, we've had a conversation about population growth and the sort of, you know, the distorting factor, we don't quite know what it is, and at some point, you know, we may just have to produce some extra water, and if it isn't there, that probably leads us to desalination. But I understand it has great environmental impact because it's so energy intensive. I wonder, in our 80-year plan, are we trying to do this process you've just talked about, which sounds very exciting if it works, next to a plant that desalinates, so we can sort of lower that? Because I worry that with such a effectively London is the only mega city in Europe, and I worry that with so many people we could have a flash problem where we just don't have enough water.
We'll always be wanting to use the energy we get from pyrolysis and our own plants as much as possible. I think the point about desalination is it's quite a good stopgap, because but it's really expensive to operate, and there are better options, frankly, for London than desalination. On the basis of what we looked at the moment, anyway.
I understand that. The only point I think about desalination is it seems like the only thing that can produce water in a short period of time.
I'm going to have to ask you to wave goodbye to our special guests.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It seems like the only that you could do in a short space of time.
Well, you're right, Seán, but if we get our planning right and we give ourselves enough headroom and we review it regularly enough, we won't get caught out and have to do something in a hurry.
I hope, and I hope that's correct, but I'm just worried for the day that we do get caught out, because water is so basic. If we don't
and you know, we moved quite quickly from a hosepipe ban that's inconvenient to emergency measures which start costing London hundreds of millions of pounds a day in economic activity. So, you know, we haven't got that many options, so which is why there's always got to be good long-term planning, reviewing the forecasts, and building in headroom.
Okay. Thank you. I'll leave it there to you.
So I think that brings us on pretty neatly, talking about planning and how we manage our water resources without incurring huge costs, but at the same time obviously being aware that we do need to bring down leakage and we do need to deal with bursts when they happen. And Jeanette is now going to lead off with some questions on trunk mains particularly, but burst water mains in general, and I'm sure a number of the other members of the committee will have a few things to say.
Thank you.
Jeanette.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Now, Tim, Richard told me earlier that the buck now stops with you. And so congratulations on this wonderful job that you have with the title of TW's Head of Water Networks. And depending on your answers, the threat here is I won't tweet your direct number. Which Richard gave me. No, he didn't. He didn't. I jest, but I can get it. I can get it. So, you weren't with us at our previous meetings, but you are up to date in terms of where we are. So let me just start then, and I'm working on the assumptions you are up to speed, that on top of the actions recommended in the forensic review, following the disastrous leaks that we had in 2016. What are you going to do on the trunk mains network as a result of that strategic review? I'd also like to add that strategic review came about because of all the burst pipes that happened then. Will you be carrying out a strategic review of the of a similar kind regarding the two main trunk bursts that occurred at the end of January in Shepherd's Bush? So let's start with those two questions.
So in respect to the trunk main forensic review, that took place in March of 2017, and post that and through consultation through our stakeholders and Ofwat, we condensed that down into our strategic plan, which was 5 core commitments, which covered 87 core initiatives. So those 5 commitments range from our operating model, so that's the concept of my role, and taking increased ownership back into Thames from our alliance partners and building the capability underneath me, because these assets are very complicated to manage. Looking at risk management, so how do we improve our models and our tools to enable us to understand risk more effectively? So the Paul Cuttle report highlighted consequence, so I think consequence was very good. The industry issue around likelihood is an area of key focus. Asset information, so understanding our assets more effectively to ensure we can close these pipes as quickly as possible or understand how the network is configured. Our event management, so our response if one of these assets were to fail, how do we get there as speedily as possible and shut the pipe in as quickly as possible, and the aftercare around that. And also our monitoring policy, so how do we ensure we're monitoring those assets as effectively as possible. So of those 87 initiatives or commitments, we've delivered about half of those to date, and the Paul Cuttle report highlighted 2 in particular of immediate focus. So the first one was around our customer representation on site if one of these assets were to fail. And the second one was our insurance policy. So how do we make it clearer to our customers if they are impacted? And I'm pleased to say both of those are now in train. So if you look at our customer representation, we now have 15 full-time people working 24/7 who can respond to any incident that might occur. So you referenced the Hammersmith and Fulham instance.
Tell us how that worked then in that instance.
What's that, sorry?
How did it work in that instance?
Yeah, so with the Hammersmith and Fulham incident, what happens is through the police or the fire brigade, because of the size and nature, you usually get a call from them first. That goes to a special telephone line, which we now have in place, again, referenced from the Paul Cuttle report. That then flags up to our duty manager, so that's a person who's on 24/7, and he contacts those customer representatives. So one of the incidents that you referenced, the Hammersmith King Street burst, we had 4 people dispatched within 15 minutes.
Within 15 minutes?
Within 15 minutes, absolutely, whose role it was to purely deal with the customers flooded. We still have the same response of sending our operatives to go and close the valves, but the customer side, we now have that in place, which is really good to see, and we're getting good plaudits from our customers because we're able to manage them in that incident. The other part, which we learnt a lot of from 2016, was around our insurance policy. So how do we get it right? And we have a booklet here which I'm happy to share, which just makes it a lot clearer to customers around our policy. And through those incidents in 2016, we've been able to test that with our customers and CC Water to understand how we've got the right policy. So as an example, we used to have an old-for-old replacement on a policy, or if your fridge was 2 years old, we replace it with a 2-year-old fridge. We've now amended that policy for new for old for any incident going forward, which we believe none of the other water utilities are providing. We've also got a discretionary policy, so that's almost like an apology kind of policy. So any inconvenience caused you're out of your home for a long period of time, Thames Water will make a payment to recompense those customers for that goodwill payment, that sort of inconvenience they've caused. So we've made that a lot clearer, which we didn't have in place in 2016. And again, that's starting to have good policies with our customers going forward. You referenced
that sounds really good, given the disastrous experience of 2016. So thanks for that.
You referenced the 2 truck mains in Hammersmith and
Yes.
Fulham, and do we undertake a forensic review of those assets? Absolutely. So what we do for every big pipe over 12 inches, we send it off for a forensic review, something called a non-destructive test, where you fire basically balls at it to understand the weaknesses and strengths of each of those spans of pipe and understand how it failed. And there could be up to 50 reasons why it fails. That usually takes between 6 and 8 weeks because it's a very complicated survey. And from that I can then understand why has that asset failed, what can we do about it, and what's the mitigation we could put in place to try and prevent it from happening again. So we're doing it for those two truck mains in question.
And have you got any information on the timescale that you're envisaging renewing the trunk mains network? I think we did get some figures, but any update on a timescale?
Yeah, so truck mains are incredibly difficult assets to replace, predominantly because it's understanding where to invest your money. So we, as I said, we understand, so risk is broken into consequence, so the impact of one of those pipes failing, and likelihood, so how often it may fail. Consequence, we understand very well. We have a very good tool that identifies that, and we've actually upgraded that tool back off the 2016 learning to understand our modelling impact. So if you put a ball on this table, the water would flow in one direction. What we learnt from 2016, especially the Islington Upper Street burst, was actually water was going in 2 directions once it got over a certain amount, and that's that secondary direction which caused the impact to our customers. So we've updated our model, so our consequence model was even better. Our challenge is likelihood, so understanding where they're going to burst. So if you look at the 2 Hammersmith and Fulham bursts 2 weeks ago, they had a quite high consequence, so in our top 30th percentile risks, but likelihood they hadn't burst in that location before. So I need to understand likelihood much more effectively to understand where to spend that money as efficiently and effectively as possible for our customers. Because we've got to have, we've got a duty of care to make sure we're spending money in the right areas. We're working hard in this area, so improving our data set, so looking at how can we understand our burst rates more effectively and the geospatial locations of where those bursts may have taken place. But more importantly is innovation. So we've just trialled a technique from a company in Norway called Reservoir, where we're trying to understand putting this asset in the pipe when it's live and there's water in it, to try and understand the thickness of the pipe. Because if I can understand the thickness of the pipe, I'll understand the likelihood and therefore be able to understand risk more effectively. So until we can do that, it makes it incredibly difficult to know where to spend the money, because we're seeing when we have done that, you're potentially replacing bad parts of pipe, but also very good pipes of pipe, all the same age, all the same condition, laid at the same time, and that's our challenge. Nonetheless, when you look at our mains replacement programme for this AMP period, so between 2015 and 2020, that reads about 30 kilometres of mains will be replaced in London.
30 kilometres?
In London, correct. For the next AMP period, between 2020 and 2025, although we're testing that with customers at the moment, this may change, it's 57 kilometres, so it is increased. Our challenge is we'd like to do more, but I need to get the balance right between cost effectiveness, the spending money wisely, to understand, because we need to understand that risk as effectively as possible, and it's understanding that likelihood is our key challenge to Thames and to the industry.
One of the things that came through with our joint work with the boroughs was they felt that Thames Water should share their information more, so that borough leaders really didn't have a clue in terms of where they were on, you know, where their mains were in terms of your priority. And we also, at that committee meeting, TfL suggested they would like to see Thames Water's risk register for trunk mains bursts, because of course it's not just your customers as residents, it's about Londoners and it's about the transport system. So if I just go over to Paul for a moment, Timothy, and just say to Paul, yes, there was a suggestion that Thames Water's risk register for trunk mains bursts, that be shared with TfL. Has that happened?
At present, I'm not aware of any long-term plans for the 57 kilometres of main that need to be replaced in London, especially on the TLR end, and that would be very appreciated because that's helped us mitigate the network long-term. Because as you appreciate, emergency bursts are exceptionally complex to manage and deal with, and we're working very closely with Thames Water to help manage that. We are doing quite a lot of work with Thames Water at the moment, trying to get more information out of them on these locations where they're going to replace long-term. So, for instance, Cadent Gas is a good example. They do grade their mains. We know exactly which ones they want to replace. They have gradings on which one's done in 12 months, which one's in 2 years, which one's in 5 years. And we've got a really good idea how we're going to deal with that. And we now have an action plan with Thames Water to try and get that extra information, because that would help us manage and plan long-term. There's Upper Street's quite a good example, actually. So that was a burst of water main and obviously caused massive damage. But when we went ahead with the planned works, we've got a huge amount of collaborative works taking place. We've got a shuttle bus service to support residents. And it was a really, I believe, effective solution to quite a horrible situation. So anything like that that we can plan ahead on in the future would be very appreciated.
So back to you, Timothy, is that on your list of actions?
Absolutely. So the 57...
It was agreed in June.
Yeah, so the issue with the 57 kilometres is we're still going through our internal sign-off and testing it with our customers. So once we've confirmed, is that good enough, is that big enough, are they the right assets to replace, we'll absolutely share them. So we've got to have a signed-off plan before I can do that.
When should we write you? In 3 months' time? Should the chair write to you?
It'll
6 months' time?
Yeah, it'll be 6 months' time.
6 months' time. We should put that as an action to write to you.
But in terms of, so I was with Islington on Monday.
Can I just clarify, the 57 kilometres, is that per annum that you're proposing, and what percentage is that of your overall number of kilometres? Because we had some figures that said on your current rate of renewal, it would be 500 years before you renewed everything, so that's quite a long period.
Per AMP period, and it's 3,200 kilometres of trunk mains across the Thames Water estate, so it's a long time. And that's because we're trying to understand this likelihood side. We would absolutely like to increase that number, but until we can understand the likelihood and know where to spend that money most effectively, it really challenges our business plans. We are doing more than just replacement, I hasten to say. We're looking at monitoring, so a key element which is a lot more cheaper when we don't understand the asset base as effectively as we currently do, because we can't understand this likelihood side because you can't see inside a pipe. We are increasing our monitoring to 25% of our network by 2025, and that incorporates a number of different technologies. So something called a Cyrenex unit, which is a clever tool that talks to each other and says there's a potential leak here, so we can get on there before it bursts. And also something called a Sahara chamber, which is whereby you put a parachute and a sonar sort of device down the pipe, which tells you there's a leak. And we do that extensively today. So that's covered about a third of our network, amongst some other techniques.
So sorry, Timothy.
Yeah.
So by 2025, will you have replaced about 57 kilometres of...
7 kilometres between 2020 and 2025.
25,
yeah.
Right. And so 2 years. So there's work in progress, but then 2020 to 25 is the big period of replacement.
When you say 25% of your network will be monitored, is that the trunk main network that will be monitored? Correct. So it's specific to that. Absolutely. And at the moment it's a third. No, because then that's going down.
So at the moment our monitoring covers 16% as of today.
16?
Yeah, 16, and it's going up to 25%. And that's through those clever techniques I just talked about, Cyrenex and Sahara surveys. We do use other techniques, so people with special correlators. So this is basically a device that says, puts sound down a main and can highlight when a leak might occur, or even with the human ear. So we use those techniques as well to find leaks as well, and that covers about a third of our network. So clever devices, 25% of the network, but we use other devices to cover about a third of the network.
And this is all new action following on from the recommend. It has been going on, but you've escalated it.
Yeah, we're building on it. So when you look at our original plan for AMP6 on truck mains in its entirety, it accumulated to £150 million.
Right.
Off the back of the incidence of 2016, we increased our investment from the board by a further £95 million to target the likes of Upper Street, etc. And therefore, next AMP period, it will be about £250 million. So we're increasing our investment plans upon our current AMP6 plans.
Okay. And there's just one more question. There was also a general agreement at the June 2017 meeting that some form of multi-utility pan-London coordination of roadworks would be helpful, which I think is what Paul has referred to. Who's leading on this? I mean, in the past we've had mayoral intervention. I can't remember whether it was the first or second administration, where there was a compact, a pan-London compact made with the utility companies, TfL, and anybody who was digging and permits and stuff. Where are we with all that, Daniel?
Well, I can comment briefly on that. There's the infrastructure high-level group has met once. I think it's meeting again next month or April, perhaps. I think it's April.
And when you say high level, who sits there then?
CEO level mostly, managing directors of key utilities regulators. And one of the subgroup pieces of work is around potentially developing an infrastructure coordination unit. So setting up geographically specific units that would have a role in kind of project managing or coordinating the delivery of utilities work.
Is the CEO from Thames Water there?
Our CEO will be there. Yeah. Steve Robertson's going personally. He went to the first one, he's going to the next one.
Right.
And he's taking an interest in all the work that's being done to prepare for it. So he's actively, Tim knows, personally involved in this.
Absolutely. I think we've actually trialled something in the Croydon Borough, where it's called a Thames Water Connect tool, which is trying to bring all of our programmes together, along with other utilities, to go to a street and try and do all that work in one place, especially for our planned works, which we believe is a very effective tool, and we will have good results, and we're aiming to roll that out to Westminster next. So we are trying something ourselves, working with our other stakeholders to try and improve things.
Just in terms of coordination as well, I mean, we also recently set up the Water Advisory Group, which has a slightly different role, so they don't overlap with the infrastructure side of things, but it's about having all the water companies and key water representatives around the table, also very senior level, sort of director, managing director level, to ensure that, you know, all water companies that impact on London and the regulators that work in London can have a forum to sort of communicate and ensure integrated approaches to water management. And we've got another meeting next month. That's chaired by Shirley Rodriguez.
It's interesting. And just from Paul from TfL, that sounds promising, doesn't it?
So, yeah, obviously, that's our job, is to coordinate work and try to plan them to work together. I think long term, that's been obviously very useful. We have a lot of works already where we have lots of utility works working together. We have objectives within TfL to make sure works collaborate. I mean, just as a few examples, so this Cadent gas example I was using, they're doing quite a lot of resilience work around London at the moment. We're talking to Thames Water, and we've got 3 locations where we're doing some localised leakage collaboration already. So it is looking promising, but yeah, it would be good to see something more strategic, I think, long term.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to my colleague.
I was going to say, I think Joanne wanted to come in as well now. Joanne.
Yes, and I raised this at our last meeting in June, and we had someone from TfL with the same job title as you, and we had Nigel Dye, CEO of the Thames Water Infrastructure Alliance, and I raised the issue of the North Circular Road, representing Enfield at Bounds Green. In 2016, it burst 9 times. This, I don't know the figures for this winter, but thankfully we've had a mild winter. But certainly there was an incident on the 8th of September last year and the 10th of October. I got a flurry of emails. And following that, I did actually write to both parties and have not received a response. So I'm going to hand you the letters at the end, so you can hopefully follow up. But
I I can say that TfL has certainly written to Thames Water to say that we would like that main replaced. For exactly that
and Tim can update us on that.
So we've met with TfL and I had a very challenging conversation, naturally, and we're very aware that that bursts frequently. We do have plans in place to replace that between 2020 and 2025. The issue I have is, do I spend the money on an area that impacts traffic or potential assets that might risk life and limb? I have to spend the money in one area and it will always be in the life and limb area. So that's where our investment is taking place this AMP period. Needless to say, we've got a duty in care to resolve some of those areas that cause traffic disruption, and is in our plan for the next AMP period. It's a very, very complicated main to replace. You can't replace it.
We did talk about there's land at the side of the road there,
Correct.
about doing like a bypass so that disruption is minimum.
It will cause significant disruption to the North Circular. Therefore, we looked at, do we actually abandon the main and reconfigure the network? And we looked at that extensively. That was probably our preferred option at one point. However, that rose quite a lot of concern in an area to the Enfield area, what we call Sewage zone, which I'm not comfortable with from a system perspective. I think that puts undue pressure to water supply to our customers. Therefore, we're going to have to come back to the option around relining that pipe or replacing that pipe, which again will cause significant disruption to the North Circular. Thus, working closely with TfL, we'll have to plan that in very, very carefully. So, difficult position to be in. We've got plans in place for the future between 2020 and 25 to do that. But it's, for this AMP period, I have that difficult situation to balance risk to life and limb or traffic disruption.
I would urge you to do it because unplanned bursts cause great disruption, and it's to business, it's to livelihoods as well. And I do have to make the point that of a private company with the profits that Thames Water has, I don't think it should be an either or. I think you're a profitable company, you should be able to do both.
Okay, I think that might be our last question. Richard, I wonder if you could just shake the two containers in front of you and just talk us through where we've got to with the demonstration.
Well, this one, as you can see, has just literally disintegrated. This one is still sitting there exactly as it was when I put it in. And one of the most interesting things that was actually said by the industry representative was that the so-called flushable wipes did not contain any plastic. That's quite interesting, and I should follow that up. If you look at the electron micro photographs, the flushable wipe does actually have clearly identifiable plastic fibres in it.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a point to follow up on there. But I think the demonstration probably speaks for itself.
Yes, I think it does. I think we can see why toilet paper going down the toilet doesn't cause much of a problem. But we can see that the white, clearly non-flushable, is going to potentially come all the way to Beckton or Frostnest pretty much exactly as it looks now.
I should say the final advantage of pyrolysis is we think if we get the plant right, we'll actually be able to put the wet wipes and things that come off the screens through the pyrolysis and therefore recover some energy from them rather than putting them into landfill. So there's quite a lot of wins to be had from getting that right.
Well, as one of our goals is to see, from the Mayor, is to see London as a zero to landfill city by 2050, let's hope that the pyrolysis is able to deal with that. Otherwise, we will be failing in that regard. Can I just ask everybody to note the discussion that we've just held with our guests and to thank our guests for their contribution?
Well done, thank you.
And are you happy to delegate authority to me as the Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any specific outputs arising from today's session?
Agreed.
Moving on to item 6, which is the Environment Committee Work Programme, which is on pages 75 to 80. Could I ask you to note the following? Agree to add plastic waste to the agenda for our March meeting, as set out in paragraph 4.5 of the report. To note the current and recent work, which has been detailed in paragraphs 4.1 to 4.2 of the report, and the agreed work programme as set out in paragraphs 4.3 to 4.4 and 4.6 of the report. Agreed. And also to note the summary of the site visit to the Corrie Environmental Energy from Waste plant in Belvedere, which you've been issued with. The date of our next meeting is the 15th of March, and it's going to be here in this very place in the chamber at City Hall. So if you'd all like to note that, there is no other business that I consider to be urgent, so I now declare this meeting is closed.
GLA Chamber